One key site in all of this was the city of Mecca. Many people journeyed to Mecca for religious reasons, particularly to visit the Kaaba. The Kaaba here, more modern picture, was a cube in the center of Mecca that housed images of 360 different deities. And so people would journey to Mecca and would usually pay some money in order to have the images of their deities brought out. Key to all of this was the Quraysh tribe there in Mecca. They were the keepers of the Kaaba. They were the ones that got the money. They were the ones that controlled which images would come out and other types of things. Eventually, the Kaaba will become an important site for Muslim pilgrimage, and we'll talk about that in another time. And actually, it will, when Muhammad comes to power, the images of the deities will be purged from it. And they would later claim that it was something constructed by Abraham, the cube representing a perfect shape in the ancient world. Now, having said that it was purged of the deities, you might wonder, or at least you might wonder now, what's inside of it then today? Right. You have all these people, right? These are all people, if you can't make it out, right, that are going to the Kaaba. So, what's in there? Well, nothing. It's completely empty. Once a year, people go in to kind of sweep it out, keep the dust down. But it is an empty box, about 42 feet in height, 14 meters. And so there's nothing in it. They don't go in it for any sort of religious rituals or anything. But the idea being that Abraham had created it as a cube for the focus of worship on God, with the perfect shape being the cube. This leads us to beginning to think about the origins of Islam. So we have this stage, right? A lot of division, focused on tribes, polytheistic atmosphere. Now, one of the things that you may have heard from news media over the past 10 years or so is that Muslims do not depict the Prophet Muhammad. And the reason this comes out is in 2006 there was this scandal when the Danish newspaper created some cartoons showing Muhammad doing a variety of horrible things. And then, of course, more recently, a newspaper journal in France doing something similar. And so frequently the news media would say, right, Muslims think it is sinful to depict the Prophet Muhammad. Well, yes and no. This picture is a more contemporary picture of Muhammad from Iran. Certain types of Muslims, Shia Muslims, some Shia Muslims, particularly those that are Sufis, we'll talk more about that another time, have no problems with depictions of Muhammad, right? Because they don't worship Muhammad. Muhammad is not a god in any sort of way. And so they have no problems with depictions of Muhammad. Now, what they'll tend to do is if they have a picture of Muhammad in their house, especially in the United States, for example, a Muslim named Omid Safi, who's a professor at North Carolina, talks about it in his book called Memories of Muhammad, talks about how he has a picture of Muhammad in his house, and when people come over who he knows have a problem with that, it's more like this is just a picture of a rather important Muslim or something like that, instead of it's Muhammad. But and so there, for some people it is problematic. But for some, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about Islamic art and architecture, any depiction of human beings is problematic, right? And so, there's a lot of differences among Muslims over depiction of human beings, especially Muhammad. Furthermore, this other picture is more ancient picture of Muhammad praying for the Kaaba in Mecca, but again, you might not be able to make this out because of quality, but he is veiled so you don't see his face, and then around his head are the flames of the prophetic office. So any sort of depictions of prophets usually have flames around their head to say this is the fire of God upon them. But even in some earlier times, there's still that hesitancy to depict Muhammad. And so, there's a lot of difference about it, but both of those reflect the importance of Muhammad in Islam. Muhammad was born in Mecca in 570 to a family who were members of the Quraysh tribe, but by his early childhood, both his father and mother had died. His father had actually died prior to his birth. And being an orphan in Mecca at the time, it was a rather low status. Even though he was cared for by his grandfather and his uncle, he still was kind of on the outside of Meccan life. Took a variety of jobs growing up. He was a shepherd for a while, which also was not looked upon favorably. Eventually, he would get into business, and in business became very successful. Was also known as a very trustworthy person in business. So, for example, if you were going off on a trip, the stories say that you could trust Muhammad to look after your stuff, and so evidently pretty trustworthy. And because of his skill, he eventually started working for a rich widow named Khadijah, who he would eventually marry. His life profoundly changed in the year 610 during the Islamic month of Ramadan, particularly I believe it's the 26th and 27th, the night of what's now called the Night of Power and Excellence. Muhammad evidently was very pious growing up, and so he would often go out into the wilderness, go out into the mountains, and just kind of go on these spiritual types of retreats. Well, according to the tradition, on one of these nights in the year 610, when he's about 40 years old, the angel Gabriel, that's that same Gabriel from the Old Testament and the New Testament, evidently, according to the tradition again, appeared to Muhammad. And in appearing to Muhammad, Gabriel announces that he is going to be God's prophet. And for the next 22 years, Muhammad gained a variety of visitations by the angel Gabriel with these revelations from God. Muhammad was to be what is known as the seal of the prophets. He was to be the last prophet in a succession of 240,000 prophets whom God had chosen throughout history. Most of those prophets, the name of those prophets had been lost to history, but many of those prophets in this tradition were people that were known from the Bible. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Joseph, David, Solomon, Moses, and even Jesus were considered to be prophets in this developing Islamic tradition. Kind of what's depicted here in this picture is kind of a family tree of prophets, with, of course, Muhammad being the one that's kind of off here by himself. Something special about him. It's important to recognize here and remember that Muhammad serves a function similar to Moses does in Judaism. Right? He is not God, right? So he's not. You shouldn't make a comparison between how Christians view Jesus, but he is the one who is given God's message to share with Muslims, or share with others who will become Muslims. Right? Muhammad's not divine; he's not worthy of worship, but is more like Moses. Well, as Muhammad goes back from this retreat and starts preaching, for the next 12 years, he's preaching monotheism in a city that makes money off of polytheism. So, as you might expect, he has very little response, and there's a lot of people that are against him. There are a few people from his family that begin to accept his message, right? Some other associates, but it's a rather small number. During this time period, he has some protection from those that would try to stop him because of the power of his wife, very powerful businesswoman at the time, and the power of his uncle, right? But they both die in the year 619. And so after 619 is when you start seeing more and more persecution from the people of Mecca. During this time, he would, again, the stories would claim that he would experience the Mi'raj. Might be translated like night journey, where he flies on a winged stallion to the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, of course, very, very important here in this early Islamic development. And from there ascends into heaven and encounters God. And so he has this other experience, interacting with a variety of prophets, etc., in heaven. The Dome of the Rock, a contemporary Muslim mosque in Jerusalem that sits on the Temple Mount, is supposedly this area where he ascends. The Quraysh tribe's persecutions continue to intensify. Muslims are beaten, they're left out in the elements, they're denied food. And eventually, because of the death of his wife and his uncle, his first wife and his uncle, Muhammad is forced to flee from the city of Mecca. He will go 250 miles north to a city known as Yathrib, which is renamed Medina. This event, this immigration from Mecca to Medina, is known as the Hijra. Word means immigration. This is the start of the Islamic calendar. So Muslims base the year of their calendar on the year of the Hijra, 622. And so they will date their time as AH, or in the year of the Hijra. The current year, up through October of this year, is 1437 AH. Muslims use a lunar calendar, and so it doesn't line up exactly with the solar calendar of the West. In Medina, Muhammad is given a lot of authority, essentially becoming the religious and the political leader and developing a Muslim commonwealth, in Arabic, Ummah. This is the burgeoning Muslim community, right? It started with a few small followers, members of his family, some servants, some other people that were connected to him. But in developing this commonwealth, there are a couple of things that Muhammad begins to change about Arabian identity. No longer are you to focus on your tribe, but instead to recognize your identity as an Islamic identity. Right? So it's uniting people together beyond their tribes. In those early years, Muhammad believes that he will find natural allies with Jews and Christians, right? Because he's preaching a monotheistic faith. Well, of course, Jews believed that prophecy had ended. Christians believed that prophecy had ended, but it had continued a little bit more past the Jewish version. And so now to accept him as a prophet of God was something that most Jews and Christians would not accept. But in those early years in Medina, in Ummah, in the covenant of Medina, right, this document written up with rights and expectations, Jews were given a lot of religious freedoms, with the assumption being they are going to work for the good of the city. But ultimately, the Jewish tribes and the Muslims have a lot of conflict, leading to some changes within Islam. Prior to a lot of the break between Jews and Muslims in Medina, prayers had been said towards Jerusalem. But after that, prayers were started to be said towards Mecca. And a lot of the antagonism between Jews and Muslims, again, wasn't present at the time, but is something that has developed because of that. And Muslims began to see Jews as a political threat. For 10 years, for 8 years, Medina and Mecca engaged in several battles. Even though Muhammad had left Mecca, there were still people that wanted to stop him. There were still people in Medina that wanted to overthrow the power in Mecca. Sometimes Muslims won these battles. The interpretation was, well, this is God's favor, right? You win, God's on your side. You lose, well, the Jews are not keeping the covenant of Medina, right? So there's, try to find a scapegoat. Eventually, in the year 630, Muhammad has amassed an army that is rather large. He marches on Medina, and because of the size of the army, the Meccans give up. There's not even a battle that time. They give up, they surrender. Those Meccans that were willing to submit, who were willing to become Muslims, were given amnesty for any actions prior to that point, and were protected. And it's at that time that he goes into the Kaaba and clears it out. Although there is a tradition that in the Kaaba, out of all those deities, all those images, there were images of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. The others are destroyed. Those are they're not worshipped, but they're saved. They're preserved. But again, that's a story. They're not around anymore to know. But it does suggest how important even Mary was in early Islam. There's more said about Mary in the Qur'an than there is in the New Testament. So she's mentioned more often in the Qur'an. So there's still that respect, even though there's some very important theological differences between Christianity and Islam, there's still that respect for Mary and for Jesus. Muhammad will die in the year 632, and that death will lead to some developments within Islam that we'll talk about in a little bit. But before that, I want to introduce the Qur'an.